Good morning. Between 25 and 35 million Kurds inhabit the modern-day mountainous areas straddling Armenia, Turkey, Iraq, Syria and Iran. This makes them the fourth largest ethnic group in the Middle East. The Kurds are a distinct community related through race, culture and language, even if there's no standard dialect. They adhere to a number of different religions and creeds, with the majority of them being Sunni Muslims. In the early 20th century, many of the Kurds started considering their own state. Following the First World War, Allies made provisions for a separate Kurdish state, but these aspirations were crushed 3 years later when the Treaty of Lausanne was signed, and which defined the modern-day territory of Turkey and made no provisions for a separate Kurdish state. This left the Kurds spread out between the different nations. Taking a look in the 21st century, you can see that the independence movements in the 5 different states vary differently and dramatically in success. This presentation will focus on the aspirations of the Iraqi and the Turkish Kurds, as their success varies most immensely. And this presentation will also focus on the global political challenge of borders, as the Kurds are stranded between the geopolitical area of 5 different states, where their claims to independence and self-determination are challenged by the ideas of territorial integrity, sovereignty and legitimacy. In September 2017, the Kurdish regional government, which is the official ruling body of the predominantly majority Kurdish region of Iraq, held an independence referendum calling for a separate Kurdish state, with 93% of the voters choosing for a separation from Iraq. The regional government considered the referendum results binding, but contrary to the independence movements in Catalonia and Somaliland, which called for immediate independence from their ruling states, the Kurdish regional government called for the referendum results as a start of state building and negotiations with Iraqi central government. The independence claim adheres to a cardinal principle in modern international law, written in the United Nations Charter Article 1 of self-determination. Self-determination states that people, based on respect for the principle of equal rights and fair equality of opportunity, have the right to freely choose their sovereignty and international political status with no interference. This worked fine after the separation from colonial rule, as the newly emerging states didn't affect the territorial integrity of the mainland countries. In the case of the Kurdish people, their claims to independence and fight for determination directly affects the territorial integrity of their ruling countries, preaching an idea of Westphalian sovereignty, the idea that every state has exclusive sovereignty over its territory. Furthermore, the territorial integrity of the countries is protected by United Nations Charter Article 2, stating that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. The claims of the Kurds is in direct violation with this charter, with the Article 2 in the United Nations Charter, as it would be changing the geopolitical area and could be considered technically an act of war. The idea of sovereignty is also why this political issue is of global importance. Currently, there are 16 states that have partial recognition or lack any recognition from the member states of the United Nations, the ruling body that considers states legitimate or not. They may have a de facto government, but a lot of the times they don't have de jure sovereignty. This comes back to the question, as we can see, most of the times the issue comes back to the question of territorial integrity. And as it seems in international law, sovereignty overrules the idea of self-determination and undermines the attempts of new nations in emerging in the international scene. The territorial integrity also deeply has its roots in a political ideology of realism, which has its interest in power politics and national interest. Realists believe that the international system is anarchic, when there is no higher power than a nation state, and that in this kind of state of nature, each state is forced to give priority to its own national interests, most commonly territorial defense and state survival. Protection and preservation of territorial integrity adheres to a specific strain of realism called defensive neorealism, proposed by the political theorist Kenneth Waltz. In the context of defensive neorealism, there is no incentive for countries to give away huge chunks of territory, as it doesn't serve their national interest. More importantly, it threatens their power into the international system and upsets the balance of power. Leaving aside the referendum results, the administrative region in Iraq enjoys a great extent of autonomy, as they have a strong economy with the local oil fields, they have trading partners, they have a strong government and military excellence due to the Kurdish armed forces called the Peshmerga. They also have strong relations with most of the countries in the EU, with representation in 22 of them, many of them having a consulate in Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan. As the autonomous region has all the criteria of the 1933 Montevideo Convention, a strong government, a local population, a defined territory, and the capability to step into international relations with other states, they can be considered legitimate in international law. This is also one of the strongest reasons why the Iraqi Kurds enjoy such a high degree of sovereignty and autonomy in Iraqi Kurdistan, compared to their counterparts in Turkey, who face constant persecution, forced displacement, extrajudicial killings, and massive human rights violations due to military actions of the Turkish armed forces. There is a deep-seated hostility between the Turkish state and the country's Kurds, who make up 15 to 20% of the country's population. Kurds have received harsh treatment for generations. In response to the uprisings in the 20s and the 30s, many of the Kurds were resettled with Kurdish names and costumes banned, and the use of the language was restricted, basically denying a separate Kurdish ethnic identity, with people being designated as Mountain Turks. In 1978, Abdullah Öcalan established the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which called for an independent state within the Turkish state. 6 years later, after establishing the organization, an armed struggle for Kurdish independence in Turkey began. Since then, more than 40,000 people have been killed and hundreds of thousands have been displaced. As the fight bears so many innocent casualties, the PKK decided to roll back the demands for an independent nation, but rather calling for demands of higher degree of autonomy, kind of relating to the ideas of Iraqi Kurdistan. Despite the new demands, the fight continued until 2013, until a ceasefire was agreed upon between the Turkish government and the PKK. What is important to note is that although being the biggest supporter for greater autonomy of the Kurdish people in Turkey, the PKK is considered an international terrorist organization by NATO and its allies, an organization that Turkey is a part of. Thus, they can't legitimately stand for the rights of the Turkish people, and actually perpetuating and weakening the fight for greater autonomy within the Turkish nation. This is worsened by the collapse of the ceasefire of PKK and the central government due to the Turkish government's reckless bombings of Iraqi Kurds during the fight against ISIL. Furthermore, People's Democratic Party, which is a pro-minority party with 67 seats out of the 600 in the Grand National Assembly, promoting Kurdish rights, is accused of connections with the PKK, thus undermining the only legitimate actor fighting for greater autonomy of the Kurdish people inside Turkey. Another important aspect to look at is how the structural violence of the Turkish government undermines and complicates the fights of the country's Kurds. Structural violence is a theory proposed by theorist Johan Galtung and refers to a form of violence wherein some social structure or social institution may harm people by preventing them from meeting their basic needs. The European Court of Human Rights since the 1970s has repeatedly condemned the Turkish government for acts of arson, civilian killings, forced displacement, food embargoes, and restrictions to public services and human rights like education and healthcare. The government also banned the use of the Kurdish language in fear of the indoctrination of the Kurdish youth against the acts of the central government. The longevity of these accusations, as they have been apparent since the 1970s, shows a pattern of systematic human rights violations by the Turkish government, undermining the legitimacy of the Turks and complicating their aspirations of ever joining the European Union. The structural violence of the government breaches first and second generation rights. Ideas of liberty through restricting the right for public assembly and peaceful protest, as many people have been violently killed, and equality, as they don't have equal access to public services and basic necessities like education and political representation. Taking into consideration all the factors, the past, the structural violence, the human rights violations, and the degree of existing sovereignty of the Kurdish people in the respective states, it's clearly visible that independence movements differ greatly in success. As Iraqi Kurds have a high degree of autonomy since the 1970s, they have been able to push their agenda for decades and create relations with not only neighboring countries, but also countries far away, thus giving the Iraqi Kurds not only internal within the autonomous region, but also external sovereignty, as they are considered a legitimate political actor in international relations. As for the Turks, the almost 100 years of persecution by the Turkish government, doubled with the human rights violations, and the affiliation to the PKK, has hampered their goals strongly, as no concessions can be made to terrorist organizations, or at least this is considered a basic rule in in any state's legislation or international organizations' principles. There is also the fear of uprising of the Kurdish people due to the years of repression by the Turkish government. But most importantly, there is the fear of the unification of the Kurdish people all across the 5 countries, leading to a huge threat on territorial integrity of the countries, further implying the reason why this is a political problem of borders. Thank you.